the stories, the journey, the wild behind the scenes, and much more. I'm Dave Anthony, and I'm the host of From Garage to Stadiums. I mean, they actually opened up for Allman Brothers, Black Sabbath, Tina Turner, and a few others. So they had some, I guess, regional success. But then Bruce, I guess, realizes, you know what, I got to do my own thing, and starts to experiment on his own, play a little bit on his own. But then the big break comes through Mike Appel, a character that is just an unbelievable character. It seems like every journey of a rock and roller has some unbelievable character who steps in and changes the destiny of the individual in question. Tell us a little bit about Mike Appel and what he did for Bruce.
Well, Mike was a guy, he was like he had a moment, a little moment, like being in a rock band, like a pop rock band in the early 60s. And I think they had like a moderate hit of one sort or the other. And, but then he got into like being a professional songwriter. Like they, used to have like, 7th Avenue in New York, and you just, you crank out these songs and you take them to publishers and you try to sell them, or you get a job with a song publisher for like $50 a week or whatever to crank out tunes. And he and his partner, Jim Kretikos, ended up writing songs and working with this guy who was like the producer of the Partridge Family, which was that TV show in the early 70s of the David Cassidy and the the band, the imaginary family band, Partridges.
Great show.
But it was like, and they were like the Monkees because they actually had hit songs. And Mike and Jim wrote one of them. I think it was "Doesn't Somebody Want to Be Wanted?" But they were still writing songs in the early 70s, 1971, when Bruce met them, but they really wanted to get into management. And so Bruce's first manager, the guy that was the manager of Steel Mill, Tinker West, took him to meet this guy, Mike Appel, who he had gotten to know at some point. And Bruce came up with a borrowed guitar with a cracked neck, and so he played him some of his new songs, which were then he was kind of writing on acoustic guitar with this kind of sort of folk singer-songwriter thing, that was so popular in the, around 1969, 70, 71. And Mike really flipped for those songs. I mean, there are songs that we know from Greetings from Asbury Park, like, Saint in the City and a bunch of the others. And so he sent Bruce away, or actually, I don't know if Saint in the City was there when he first auditioned for him, but he sent him off. He liked what he heard and sent him off to write some more songs. And Bruce went to California, where his parents were living by then. And he came back a few months later and called up Mike and went to his office and played him some new songs he had written. And Mike was like, okay, this is going to work. So he signed him up, and he just started cranking out these songs. He was incredibly prolific at the time. And within a few months, Mike had this kind of wild-eyed dedication to Bruce. Like, he totally heard what Bruce was capable of, and he totally got it.
And he mortgaged his house, you wrote.
Yeah, when he got to that point, a little later when they had to get the band on the road. But it was like, so he managed to get an appointment to see John Hammond, who was the famous A&R man at Columbia Records, who had discovered, signed Dylan and signed Billie Holiday and signed a whole bunch of, really significant artists. And he talked his way into Hammond's office with Bruce, and Bruce played like one song. And Hammond was, instantly like, you got to be a Columbia artist, and played him some more songs, and then took him up to meet Clive Davis, who was the president of Columbia at the time. And Clive got it immediately and signed him. And one of the things that Bruce really connected with Mike was, there was something a little crazy in his eyes, and that's what I needed. He needed someone who was going to have that almost kind of religious dedication to him as an artist, and just go to the wall, with him. And that was, Mike was all in, and that's what Bruce was after.
So this leads to album one. They signed to Columbia, and Greetings from Asbury Park, as you mentioned, released in January 73. Bruce is about 23 years old, I guess, at the time. It features songs like Blinded by the Light, Growing Up, and It's Hard to Be a Saint in the City. And then that's followed up a few months later by Wild, the Innocent, and the E Street Shuffle, released in November 73. And that featured Rosalita, 4th of July, Sandy. How were these albums received kind of critically?
Well, they're two very different records, which is sort of interesting. The first record, when Mike and then John Hammond saw Bruce as a folk, like a solo, singer-songwriter with a acoustic guitar, which was super hot at the time. Think about James Taylor and Jackson Browne and those guys with those early records that they were putting out then. And they were like, that's what we want this record to sound like. And Bruce had spent the vast majority of his career up to that point as a lead guitar player in a big noisy rock band. So he was like, okay, he's just trying to get across, really. So at first they kind of reached this compromise on the first record where the goal was to make it sound like a Cat Stevens record. We had that same sound, we got a little bit of band going on behind you, but it's still very acoustic based. It's pretty mellow, But when it was time to perform and promote that record, Bruce was like, I have a band, I have these guys that I play with all the time. And if I'm going to go on the road, I need to bring a band. And Mike got it pretty quickly and was like, okay. But, John Hammond and the Columbia Records guys weren't certain at first, but sent him on the road with his band. And then just as the months went by and the band became a much bigger part of not just the performance, but just Bruce's sense of who he was as an artist. And so The Wild and the Innocent is like a band record. And it's, a lot of those songs, like the title track, the E Street Shuffle, is about being in a band and about seeing a band perform. And that record is much more elaborate just in terms of, and Kitty's Back is like the one example of Bruce's wild early lead guitar style, with a guitar solo, it just goes on and on. And a lot of soloing taking place. But the songs are getting that much more elaborate, and he's becoming a much better songwriter, even in the space of a few months, and writing songs like Rosalita and Incident on 57th Street and New York City Serenade that are really sophisticated, interesting songs that he performs with a full band. So that's really the kind of Van Morrison-y moment where you really, or sort of Joe Cocker in the, where it's a big band and there's a lot of people, there's a lot of playing taking place, and it's a real, that's both of those records really resonated with critics who I think heard how sophisticated Bruce was becoming as a songwriter.
And there's a seminal moment there, I guess, on sort of subsequent, I guess, where they're touring these small venues, that John Landau writes his famous quote about Bruce, or a review, and he says, "I've seen rock and roll's future, and it's Bruce Springsteen," which was a hell of a statement because Bruce wasn't exactly well known at the time.
No, the first two records were kind of flops. Columbia put a lot of muscle behind the first one, Greetings from Asbury Park, and didn't sell that many records behind that. And there was still a certain amount of faith in Bruce, and then he put out Wild and the Innocent, but that didn't do well at all either. And the record company, and also I think Clive Davis had left CBS at that point, and or Columbia, I should say, and John Hammond's star was maybe falling a little bit. So there was like a new generation of leadership at the record company that didn't care about Bruce, hadn't signed him, weren't involved in his career. But these were the guys that were much more interested in Billy Joel, and much more interested in these other artists that were, kind of felt like they had more hit potential. So after those first two records, by early 1974, and Bruce and his band are just chugging from bar to bar to bar, just trying to build a following, and the shows are getting a certain amount of buzz. But it wasn't until John Landau, who was then the record review editor for Rolling Stone, which was a very high profile and powerful position for a music journalist to have at that point. Sure. Dave Marsh took him to see a show in Boston, and John was like, why? It was pasted against the wall. And he went home and he wrote this sort of cri de coeur of a review where he said, like, this wasn't, he was having a tough go of it in his life, was getting divorced and feeling old. And it was like, because it was his 27th birthday. So, he's well past it at that point. And so he went to the show, and it was like, on a night when I needed to feel young and to remember what drew me to music in the first place, Bruce Springsteen sort of showed me everything and completely altered his life. Right. And so he cranked out this review, and it was like, it really spun the heads of all the people at Columbia. But at the time, they were still, Bruce's sales did not seem to warrant releasing a third record. But they said, okay, we'll give you enough money to make a single. And if you can make a single that sounds like it might get played on the radio, we'll give you the dough to make the rest of the record. And so he went home and wrote Born to Run. And they spent, yeah, right. And then spent 6 months.
That's a hell of a response. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. It is. But it's like Bruce's having his back against the wall is utterly like his comfort zone.
And so John Landau, the Rolling Stone reviewer who wrote that amazing quote about the unknown Bruce Springsteen being the future of rock and roll, is brought in to be a co-producer of the Born to Run album and ultimately becomes Bruce's manager.
Bruce was laboring, over every tiny aspect of it. And he began to feel like they needed another set of ears to come in. And so they hired John to come in and co-produce. And that became like this, so John helped them, move to a different, recording studio and turned it into this completely, and they made this transformative record that broke through in a big way. And when the Columbia people heard what they were doing, they were like, they had started placing ads quoting John Landau and basically saying, like, there's this buzz building about this guy. We're going to totally get behind him. Like, this is the guy of the future. Everyone needs to pay attention to this. And when Born to Run came out in August of 75, it was like, as I can't remember which critic said this, like, it delivered on Springsteen's promise on every level. And suddenly he was like the guy of the moment, and famously, notoriously was on the cover of Time and Newsweek the same week in October of 75, which at the time was meaningful. Now I don't think anybody would care, but at the time that was huge.
I mean, this is just next level writing on this album that he puts out with his back against the wall to kind of produce first Born to Run, as you said, and then other songs, Thunder Road, Jungle Land, 10th Avenue Freeze Out. This album goes on to sell 6 million copies in the US, 3 million elsewhere. I know you've got a forthcoming book on Born to Run. What are your thoughts? I mean, as you look at that album, looking at it 50 years later, what is the sort of thoughts that you have as you kind of ponder it?
Well, like you said, I mean, it's extremely sophisticated. He's really beginning to understand exactly who he is as a writer, what his voice is, and what his milieu is. And he's developed, he's come to understand that there was something just heavily symbolic about, cars and the highway in America, I mean, and at the time, as he has said subsequently, it was that weird sort of period in mid-70s America that was like post 1960s, post Woodstock, post Watergate. There was a lot of cynicism that had built up in society, and it was easy to be cynical. Yeah, exactly. So there was this sense of foreclosed options and of the borders kind of creeping in on America, and he was like, had this, so he wanted to express something about that, but then also express something about the constant promise in the country, the idea that you can recreate, you can hit the road and go somewhere else and recreate yourself in your own image.
Yeah.
And that brings that line at the end of Thunder Road. It's that key line, it's a town full of losers and we're pulling out of here to win. That's a significant line.